Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I realize it's Easter Monday. So for those of you who observe, we really appreciate you taking the time to tune in into our talk today on doubling down on diversity, equity, inclusion, and self-care during COVID-19. I'm Stephanie Ramirez. I'm a senior associate with the Raben Group based in our New York office, and I'll be joined today by two of our colleagues. So the Raben Group is a national public affairs and strategic communications firm. We're committed to opening the doors of power and influence for lasting inclusive change. Our firm consists of majority of people of color, majority women, and majority of folks who identify as LGBTQ+. Our Beyond Diversity Strategies is a practice area within the Raben Group committed to helping leaders and their organizations with transformational change through tailor-made solutions for diversity, equity, inclusion, and beyond. We are a thoroughly diverse group of DEI professionals, and we deliver what we embody. So now I am being joined by two of our colleagues that will be speaking with us today. Kerryn Agyekum is a principal at the Raben Group and brings more than 20 years of experience as a diversity, communications, and HR practitioner. And Patty First is an executive and life coach and a founding principal at the Raben Group. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Of course. So just to set the context for today's conversation, COVID-19, as we know, has created a lot of uncertainty as it spreads across the nation. However, it's also created a lot of opportunity to demonstrate organizational commitment to our people and to those we serve doing this work. Just as an FYI, we will have a Q&A at the end of today's discussion to allow folks joining us to ask Kerryn and Patty any additional questions. So COVID-19, again, as we have all seen, and it's not surprising, is affecting marginalized communities such as communities of color, low-income communities at a much higher rate. While diversity, equity, and inclusion work has become trendy over the past few years, we believe it's especially important now to focus on this work, be explicit about it, and not let it fall to the side. The Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development is a New York City-based nonprofit, and they've used data released by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to determine which New York City neighborhoods are being hit hardest by this pandemic. As you can see in this picture, they found that high rates of positive COVID-19 cases are concentrated in neighborhoods where many of New York's frontline service workers reside. These neighborhoods are disproportionately communities of color, and they correspond to both high rates of positive COVID-19 cases and a high rent burden. COVID-19 is starkly revealing the racial and economic inequity that's deeply embedded in New York City's socioeconomic infrastructure. And of course, this mirrors a lot of other cities as well. So Kerryn and Patty, can you both speak to how you look at this information on the map and how you're interpreting it?
Sure, Patty, why don't you start and I'll jump in.
Sure, happy to. So the first thing that I'd say is to remember that many of these communities are already experiencing extremely high levels of stress and trauma. We're experiencing that before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. That's especially true over the last 3.5 years for a lot of these communities. And then not to mention layered on top of that is you've got hundreds of years of systematic oppression that means that these communities often have less access to the institutions that can keep them safe and healthy. So when you're thinking about offering support to these communities, before you offer that support, just really check yourself, check your assumptions, and center yourself in where the community is. So by centering yourself, then you can ask them, tell me what it is that you need. Don't offer what you think they need, please ask. I think the other thing here is it's important when we talk about self-care, especially to recognize that not everyone is in the same situation, right? We can't all just take our yoga class online because not everyone has the same access to the internet. So it's really hard, for example, to meditate for 30 minutes when you share your apartment with extended family. So be sensitive to people's situations and listen to what they tell you that they need.
Yeah, I think that's right, Patty. I would just add to that before COVID-19, it was estimated that about 61% of people or employees were covering Covering is the notion of sort of hiding an element of yourself or your life because you're worried about the discomfort it may bring to others, or that people may somehow not view you as serious about your organization or your position. The implications to organizations with employees who cover include performance issues, productivity issues, high rates of sort of burnout and low engagement. And then the impacts to the people who are covering themselves are both physiological and mental. So we're on a webinar, so I'll ask this as a rhetorical question. How much do you think that those numbers have increased, and how much are they exacerbated by being in this new normal?
Thank you. A lot. I want to shift the conversation a little bit. We've seen those stark numbers and how COVID-19 is affecting, our self-care, marginalized communities. And so I really just want to ask both of you, starting with Kerryn. Kerryn, can you tell us what DEIJ looks like right now?
Yeah, so again, I loved everything that Patty mentioned. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in sort of the normal context, largely focused on our traditional dimensions, right? How do we differ race, gender, gender expression or identity, sexual orientation, level of ability, military status, etc. Today, it's really about how we are the differences in experiencing where we are, right? So I read something recently that said that we're not working from home, right? We are at home during a crisis, and we're trying to work, right? So if I am the caregiver of multiple generations, or if I'm a single person and I'm separated by, friends and family, or I am a member of the LGBTQ plus community, right? So you're sort of intersecting now these marginalized identities within sort of these challenges that we're all experiencing. What does that really look like? And to Patty's earlier point, what do I need that's different now than it was before the pandemic? From an equity standpoint, and my hat's off to my fellow HR colleagues that are now having to make these decisions around performance and development and compensation and in some cases offboarding. What does it really look like to sort of check our biases at the door to make sure that sort of everyone is experiencing these different transactional phases in the same way, right? And then when you think about inclusion, how do you feel connected in the frame of social distancing? What does that really look like? And then the justice. We're all now activists and advocates behind our computer screens. So if you're a leader that has more time because you're not traveling, what does it look like to lend your voice to the causes that matter? If you're an organization who's typically provided philanthropic support, both bodies and financial, to advancing social campaigns, what does that look like now digitally? So it's being very deliberate now more than ever to have a plan for that, and to really lean into that plan.
Thank you for that. And Patty, I'm sure a lot of us want to know during such a time of uncertainty, how does one stay in the fight during all of this?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think you have to stay in the fight and also be cognitive of your staff's needs and your own needs, right? So the first thing is to take care of yourself. Because if you're too stressed out to help yourself, then you can't help anyone else. It's the reason why airlines say put your own oxygen mask on first before helping others. If you don't have any oxygen, you can't help anybody else with their mask. And this is really important for advocates, because as advocates, we often put ourselves and our own needs last, right? We're kind of taught to do that in advocacy spaces. But when we do that in a time like this, when our stress hormones are rising, and in order to sustain that stress, our brains are decreasing other functions like our own immunity and our own ability to focus. And, that stress messes with our sleep and it messes with our appetite. And so if you are not focused on decreasing your own stress, you will get sick. You might not be able to focus. You might not be sleeping. You might not be eating the way that you want to be eating. You might not be eating nourishing things. And that means that you are not going to be able to help the people that you want to help in the way that you want to help them. Okay, so first, take care of yourself. The second is don't stop your advocacy. right? Because most of us work in social justice because we care about inequality. And now is a time when those inequalities are front and center. Whether you advocate for broadband access or immigration or healthcare, you're needed right now. You're needed in the fight. So take care of yourself so that you can stay in the fight.
Great, thank you for that. And I just want to jump back to Kerryn. Kerryn, can you talk a little bit about how organizations can still create inclusive work environments that are remote, and also what the support for your staff look like right now?
Yeah, great question, Stephanie. Thank you. And I loved so much what Patty mentioned when we first started, because it's exactly right. You have to support people in the way that they need to be supported. As I mentioned earlier, everybody is sort of experiencing this pandemic in a very different way. As I mentioned, there are people who have friends and family and colleagues that are scattered all over the world in some cases, and they're craving connection and might actually have more time. So virtual happy hours and dance parties and things of that nature might be spot on for them. But then there may be others who are caring for a little one, either with a partner and without, or a senior family member. And all they want is the bandwidth and guardrails to be able to do their work and to be able to sort of sign off and focus on their other obligations. So I think it's about meeting people where they are. And in order to do that, you have to know what's going on with everyone. And so what we're really counseling people to do is create forums so that you can hear from people around exactly what it is that they need, and then start to create the proper forums or platforms that allow people to give. And what we're seeing is that wonderful innovation and support is coming from that. I'll give a Raben example. We've got these sort of virtual employee groups, right? And Raben Kids is one, for example, that I'm really passionate about. Not only are parents sharing learning resources and videos and dance classes, but we've actually started thinking about how we do virtual babysitting. So allowing our older children to sit and read to the little ones, and parents who have time or breaks, doing that as well. So again, it's really meeting people where they are. And so we're really encouraging organizations to pour in and really support and encourage their employees to participate in things like this.
Thank you. And Patty, can you talk to us about what should organizations be cognizant of right now as it relates to self-care? You mentioned earlier that you can't, if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't take care of others. So, what does that look like right now?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is to give your people permission to do it, right? So think about solutions like changing your sick days to not be sick days, but to be wellness days. To be clear about what's covered by your employee assistance program, for example, if you have one. Is therapy covered if people need therapy? Allow flexibility in getting the work done. What Kerryn was just talking about with parents who are also taking care of kids. It's really an impossible time right now, right? All of a sudden, you are a teacher when you weren't a teacher before, and you are not trained to be a teacher, right? And you're still trying to get your work done. So allow some flexibility in how that work gets done, maybe in the exact hours that people are working during the day, and then offer some stress management training, or at least stress management tips, or a place where people can come to talk about what they're feeling. I think this is such a collective moment where we're all collectively feeling a lot of things like grief and sadness, and people are scared, and allowing them to come together to talk about that can really be healing and helpful. And then encouraging people to take care of themselves, right? So letting them know they've got permission. They've got permission to rest when they need to rest. They've got permission to go and pause and take a walk around the block. They've got permission to take half an hour and go for a run. Whatever is going to make them able to release some of the stress that they're feeling is really, really important right now.
Yeah, and I would just add sort of one more thing before we move on. This notion of storytelling, I loved what Patty mentioned, that we're sort of all collectively in this together. But again, I can't stress that enough that that togetherness is a very disparate experience, home to home, family to family. And so, wearing my communications hat, the opportunity for storytelling in these moments is super important. So doing things like digital campaigns, right? We'll be celebrating Earth Day soon. How do we allow people to share how they are taking care of the earth from their homes and giving them a platform to highlight that? We'll be in Asian, Heritage Month soon in May. How do we really lean into these populations, both within our communities and around the world, to sort of celebrate being a part of those communities in a very connected way. So it's a really important time right now to not only sort of lean into one another, but to be supportive of the communities around us.
Yeah, and Stephanie, one more thing on that too. Thank you, Kerryn. That was super helpful. Is to not assume that you know somebody's situation, which I think is part of what you're getting at with covering, Kerryn. So don't assume that you know what's going on in someone's household, because you probably don't. They might be taking care of young kids and just trying to hold it together. They might be really missing being social. They might be really glad for alone time. Like, you don't actually know what the situation is, and don't make assumptions that you do.
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. Very well said. And Kerryn, I just want to jump back to you really quickly. So, organizations right now are at risk for giving up on equity. Where will this happen first? And what would you say are ways that organizations can avoid these pitfalls right now?
Yeah, so I think even in the former context with diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, there were misperceptions that this work was somehow extra, or, it's sexy at the time, or it's something we do if we have extra resources, financial, human, time, or otherwise. And none of those things are the case right now. I think we are in an unprecedented time where the organizations who are innovating and adapting will be the ones to sort of survive and be leaders. And you can't be so focused on, just sort of delivering on the status quo, your mission, vision, and goals when your people are struggling. And if they are operating from a scarcity mentality, or if they are so stressed that they can't even move through, their projects, right? Let alone be able to innovate. So I think at this time, it's really about, again, our unsung heroes in human resources. I think it's about pouring in to them, their policies. I think it's about really making sure that you are demonstrating that your people are your most valuable asset. It's important to note that people are online now more than ever, and everybody has a family member that works somewhere. Mm-hmm. So all of the work that you might be doing externally to sort of manage your brand in the face of COVID-19 can be completely undone if there's even sort of a hint of lack of equity or support with your staff. So I think it's really important to be mindful of that. And, I love this quote. I think Maya Angelou said that people will forget what you said and what you did, but they won't forget how you made them feel. And so it's really important in this moment to make sure that people feel supported.
I agree. And I think that's a really good point, particularly that last quote that you shared. Thank you for that. Patty, what's the best way to cope with this level of uncertainty? What's normal? What's a signal that someone might need more help? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you for asking that question, Stephanie, because it's really important. The uncertainty of this is extremely stressful. I don't have to tell anyone. And that stress is experienced in a lot of ways. Like there's uncertainty about our health, and people are scared about their health, their relatives' health, their friends' health, their community's health. There's uncertainty and stress about the economy. What's going to happen? Where is the bottom? And then how long will it take to recover? And what does that recovery look like? There is stress about job loss. There is stress about what is happening to people's communities and maybe the small businesses in their communities. There is a lot. I mean, it truly is unprecedented for those of us who are alive right now anyway. And for those of us who have anxiety anyway, it can be really hard to stay present and not kind of spin into a whole lot of what ifs. If you're feeling very stressed or anxious or depressed, it's extremely important that you seek help, professional help. If you can't sleep, or if stress is getting in the way of your daily activities, please seek help. There's a lot that therapists are doing right now. There are so many resources available at the moment. Most therapists are starting to do virtual sessions, either by phone or by secure video links. And there's all sorts of other new types of ways of receiving therapy, whether it's online or by text, or there's so much that's out there right now. So please find help, ask for help, tell your human resources folks when you need help, because they can help you find someone. And hopefully it's also included in your employee assistance program if you have one. And that program can also help you to find a therapist. But now is like, if you've ever thought it might be nice to talk to someone about some of these things, now is the time to do it.
There's no time like the present.
No time like the present.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Kerryn, can you tell us what particular challenges come with keeping, the energy for an organization as it relates to DEIJ work?
Yeah, so we've already talked a little bit about sort of the strain on resources. I mean, the reality is there are organizations that just may not make it, and they're kept up. Their leaders, their staff, their boards are kept up at night by that fact, right? We've also talked about just sort of the misperceptions with prioritizing the work, but I think, framing it in the context we've talked about today around experiencing this pandemic differently, what equity and inclusion and justice can look like virtually, really goes a long way in terms of mitigating that challenge. And then I'd say the third thing that we hear that is also a little bit of a misperception is that staff will not be paying attention, or they're just so distracted by what's happening around them that they wouldn't lean into the work if organizations were offering it. And I really push back on that. I think people are looking for ways to engage with things that are outside of COVID-19 and the new realities at home that Patty talked a little bit about, right? And so if organizations can create sort of bite-sized and meaningful interactions that give staff a moment of relief from what's going on around them, I think that's the level of care that they can really sort of pour into their teams. And I think if you are partnering with organizations like the Raben Group that really know how to do that in a customized and very authentic way, your efforts you'll continue to see the momentum.
Great. And Patty, can you talk to us about how leadership can help managers and staff in this moment? What are some specific things that the leadership of an organization can do right now?
Yes, absolutely. First, make sure your staff's okay. Right. So, and that who's under extra stress, maybe because of their home or their health situation or their financial situation. So make sure that you do what you can to know their situation. And then make sure that your staff knows all of the resources that are available to them, right? So encouraging people to take a wellness day if they might need one. And also recognizing that your managers might need extra help right now. I think it's really important to be transparent about that. A lot of managers are spending extra time helping staff to cope with their own stress around the pandemic. That's not necessarily a skill that every manager has, right? So some people probably find that very draining. And giving your managers a space to talk about that and to learn how to manage people under stress and to learn how to manage people remotely is important because it's not a natural skill. And it's a really unprecedented situation that we're in. So second, leadership should be really clear about expectations right now while people are working remotely so that staff knows what's okay and what's not okay. And within that, I think, is being transparent about challenges and also positive things that are happening in your own organization. And then I think the final thing that I'd say is that leadership should really be flexible in terms of work hours and focus more on output. As Kerryn, I think, mentioned that earlier, rather than working from 9 to 5 every day, just recognize kind of the needs of the situation and the needs that your staff might be in.
And what would you say are the most immediate needs of staff right now?
Wow. Let's see. So I would say the most immediate needs of staff are probably take care of yourself, to understand
Kerryn, what would you say are the most immediate needs that you're seeing right now for staff and other partners?
Yeah, so I would say with regard to staff, be honest about your circumstances. If your organization has really sort of invested in platforms for you to connect with your manager, to connect with one another, certainly that open door within HR, be very honest about your circumstances and what you need. So try and avoid covering, right? Work is now at home and home is work, and everybody's in the same situation. I would suggest that you participate and suggest, right, internal burnout prevention and coping resources. So, I mentioned one of the things that we're doing at the Raben Group for people who are parents. Be willing to lean in and share and give ideas. The last thing I'd say is continue to stay connected. As Patty mentioned, the worst thing you could do is sort of self-isolate. Continue to stay connected to your colleagues, continue to stay connected to the world around you, but obviously be mindful to sort of turn off when you need that time. I would say in the space of sort of working remotely, again, I think Patty covered a lot of it, really set and respect work hours, right? So a perfect example is that I'm on the West Coast and my colleagues are mostly on the East Coast. I sort of commit to answering emails by starting at about 7 or 8 or so, because I know that it's starting to get a little later East Coast, and then I know that by about 3 or 4 o'clock Pacific, I need to start to kind of wind down because of other needs. So really be mindful to set those work hours, and if you are a coworker, again, on a different coast, because geographical diversity is a thing, be mindful to respect those things. I'd say, again, reinforcing what Patty shared, the focus on output, right? So being very clear with your team, managers, these are my priorities for the week. And you might see emails from me, at odd times, East Coast time, or odd times, Pacific time, but those are the times that I can get the work done, and this is how I can meet my deadline. So being able to be both clear about that for yourself and with your teams will be important. And then just give grace and empathy. If I, one of the things that's just been lovely about having to switch gears has been the ability for my teams and partners, sometimes you might see a 5-year-old, with her little head on my shoulder, right? And so, and I've had coworkers that, where we brought the kids to the meetings and they could meet each other. So just giving a little grace and empathy, certainly to yourself, sort of this notion of taking self-care beyond care and really being compassionate with self. That's really important during this time. And to do that, for you, for colleagues, again, for individuals that you might be engaging with. And then lastly, if I could just sort of reiterate some of the things that Patty mentioned about sort of leadership, right? So in this unprecedented time where managers and leaders might need a little bit more support, really pouring into them around sort of decisive decision making and key management skills, not just being able to manage a fully remote workforce, but managing across difference within that fully remote workforce is going to be extremely important as well, now more than ever. So those would be just sort of my highlights when we think about staff needs, leadership needs, and certainly having to conduct operations and business in this new reality.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Kerryn. And I know we have lost Patty. Oh, Patty is back.
Sorry about that.
That's totally fine. Patty, do you want to just go back and just that last point that you were making before we move on to our top tips?
Sure.
So I know we were talking about, what are the most immediate needs of staff and managers and just organizations as a whole right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, and I'm not exactly sure where you lost me, so I apologize if I repeat. But I think the first thing is that the most important thing is to recognize as staff that you're probably really stressed, right? Everyone is really stressed. Our stress hormones are extremely high right now. So taking care of yourself is incredibly important. Taking care of yourself and lowering your stress, managing your stress is going to be what allows you to really get back to being able to focus, what allows you to sleep, what allows you to have patience with people. And there are some really proven ways to lower your stress levels. I can go into this more in a minute, but resting, pausing, and moving are 3 ways to get your stress levels down, to get the stress that is coming in to go out of your system. And by resting, I mean sleeping, like resting when your body says it needs to rest. By pausing, I mean stopping and noticing, stopping and meditating, stopping and just being present in the moment and trying not to think about the future and what might happen. And moving is really exercise and movement and anything that you can do to move your body in whatever way feels good to it. So I think the most important thing for staff right now is getting that stress managed and really lowering your levels of stress.
Great, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you both for your thoughtful insight. I want to move on to if we could just move into both of you providing just your top tips with coping with COVID-19 as it relates to leadership, self-care, working remotely. Kerryn, if you could start us off on your top tips of the role of leadership during this time and what managers can really do, to help their staff.
Yeah, so I've talked a little bit about this along the way, but I think one of the biggest thing is you really have to know who's in your population. And the best way to know is to create those forums for two-way feedback and actually, again, really supporting, as Patty mentioned earlier, giving people permission and agency to participate in those forums. I know sometimes, again, pre-pandemic, a lot of those types of sort of employee groups and virtual groups and, leadership can sometimes be concerned about time management when it comes to those things, but we really need to reframe it. And it really needs to be focused on how you give people sort of relief in those platforms and support in those platforms, and more importantly, use them as ways to keep your fingers on the pulse of what's happening within your organization. We've talked a lot about prioritizing your people, and again, really reinforcing the need to focus on management skills, building your leadership capability beyond just managing a fully remote workforce, which is super important, but managing across difference across that fully remote workforce would be really important. And then, leaders are people and humans too, right? So how do you sort of model a lot of the behavior that we've talked about, right? So setting and keeping work hours, encouraging actually taking your own advice, spending the 30 minutes going for a run, or, moving as Patty mentioned, and getting the right rest, and being very vocal about the fact that you're doing that, right? So that goes back to giving people agency and permission.
Great. And Patty, can you give us your top tips for the role that leadership should be playing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And the first one is really to be sensitive to what your people are going through, right? We've talked about this a little bit already. So it's very important to pay attention to and invest in your people at the moment. And that can look like starting conversations by asking people how they're doing. What is your personal weather report? What's your professional weather report? Don't force them to answer if they don't want to talk about it. But the fact that you ask will be noticed and appreciated by your staff. But recognize, though, again, like we talked about, that you don't know what their situation is. They might be caring for young kids. Their spouse may be out of work. They may not be sleeping. So just, be sensitive and kind of extra gentle to what your people are going through. The second thing is to be aware of and manage your own stress, right? This is really important, because if you, as the boss, are extremely stressed, the likelihood is that you're going to be communicating that stress to your staff, right? And that stress is not the best for motivating people to work and to innovate. As Kerryn was saying earlier, to get into that innovation and a more abundance mindset. So don't bottle your stress up, right? You can and should be vulnerable where appropriate with your staff, but also notice how your own stress is affecting you and how you might react to people and to situations, right? And try to manage your own stress. And then the last thing is really to think about and know, how do you want to show up during this time? Like when you look back in 10 years on this, how do you want to say that you showed up during this pandemic? And what are the supports that you need to be able to show up the way that you want to show up? For example, I want to show up as grounded, and I want to show up as generous, and I want to show up as creative right now. And I know that in order to do those things, I need adequate sleep. I'm somebody who needs 8 hours a night. So I've got to get sleep. I know that I need to take a breath and to meditate every day, because that helps me to stay patient and grounded. I know that I need to be getting regular exercise. So I know that those are the supports that I need to show up in the way that I want to show up. And what I do is I make sure that those are worked into my day every single day. I prioritize those things so that I can show up the way that is going to be most helpful to the other people that I work with.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, Stephanie, before we move on, I love this notion of thinking about how you want to show up. And I would add to that, as leaders, what do we want our legacy to be, right? And so I go back to how we are making decisions in this time and what we are being mindful of, particularly in the space of equity. Right, you have sort of the livelihoods of the people who work for you in the palms of your hands. How are we thinking about how people get managed up, through, around, and sadly sometimes out of the organization? So really actually being very deliberate and leaning in to enforce, I use a strong word on purpose, sort of the perpetuity of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Yeah, and even if that's the situation that your organization is in, that you have to let people go, there are different ways of letting people go. And there are definitely ways to handle that are with empathy and compassion for people, which what we should be leaning into now.
Definitely. So can we move on to tips for self-care? So Kerryn, if you could talk to us about just your top 3 tips for, how can people provide self-care for themselves during this pandemic?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about that before and throughout, but just reinforcing, people don't know what you need unless you share. And to Patty's point, to the level and depth that you're comfortable. Again, realize and understand that it's going to be pretty difficult to check your whole self at the door when your door is both your home and your office. So as much as you can, be vulnerable and open yourself up to your support systems and the organizations that you're in, and you'd be surprised at how you can discover, that level of support. I'd say, again, in that same vein of organizations not knowing what you're going through unless you're vocal about it, if there are things that you have ideas for, ways that you could lean in to more self-care that aren't currently being offered by your organization, raise your hand, right? It's important to just ask and put it out there and see what you get back. And you'd be amazed at the innovation that comes from doing that. And then again, isolation and staying quiet in this time is probably one of the worst things we could do physiologically and mentally. So really being able to just stay connected, like I said, to friends, family members, coworkers, and allowing that grace as we're all sort of going through this in very different ways.
Yeah. And Patty, can you share your top couple of tips for self-care right now?
Absolutely. The first one, and I've kind of touched on all of these too, but the first one is really to connect into yourself, right? Tune into your body and listen to what your body is telling you. Is your body telling you that you're tired? Then you should rest. Is your body telling you that you need to burn off some stress? Then you should figure out, how do I burn off that stress? Do I need to move my body? Do I need to do some yoga? What do I need to do? And now is not a time to really push through the tired or to push through the stress, right? And soldier on. Because when you're under extreme stress, your body can't do that as easily and your brain can't do that as easily because your body and your brain are so taxed by the stress already. So it's really important that you tune in and listen to what your body's telling you and do what your body is telling you that it needs, because that's how you're going to stay healthy and that's how you're going to be able to really meet this moment the way that you want to. The next is what I said before, remembering the acronym RPM, rest, pause, and move, right? Resting is resting when your body needs rest, but it's also making sure that you're getting adequate amounts of sleep at night. Sleep's really important because it's the time when our brains kind of categorize and go through our days and put things away, right? And organize things so that we can be refreshed the next day and not kind of constantly replaying what happened yesterday or what happened last week in our head, right? So rest is like, it's crucial right now. And you are probably feeling more tired than you normally do. And that is because of the stress hormones that have increased in your body during this pandemic. Pausing can be anything that helps you to be grounded and helps you to stay in the present moment. So that could be meditation, which is what I do. That could be just noticing your breath. Sometimes, before I go into a meeting, I'll just pause and take a couple of breaths where I'm really noticing my breath to help to ground and center me before I go into the meeting. It could be noticing things. So, taking a walk around your neighborhood and noticing, like with intention, what's blooming in your neighborhood. Noticing all of the trees that are pink, or all of the trees that are white, or all of the flowers that are purple, something like that, something that keeps you present. And then moving. Aerobic exercise is really, really good for getting stress hormones to lower in your body, right? And also for increasing the hormones like dopamine and endorphins that make you feel good, which is something I think we forget about a little bit right now because we're under a lot of stress. We also want to increase things that are going to make us feel good. So whatever that is for you, whether that's going for a run or doing some yoga or going for a walk, whatever it is, do some movement. And then the last thing is to limit your stress inputs. And by this, I mean, think about your day and think about the pieces of your day that are stressful, right? Each of those is a stress input. So for example, right now, work might be a stress input. Like work might be really stressful. The news is probably a stress input. Social media might be a stress input, right? Helping your kid with homework might be a stress input. If you don't like to cook and you're suddenly having to cook from home all the time instead of going out, that could be a stress input. So think about the stress inputs in your day and try to have an equal number of ways that you're getting the stress out, right? So that will help to make your day feel more balanced on the whole, and it will also help, like I said earlier, to reduce some of the stress hormones.
Great, thank you for that. And if we could move on to Patty, just your tips for working remotely. You know, what can organizations do? What can individuals do? How can we, be more, more efficient, or just really just any tips that you have on that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I dropped off for this part earlier. Kerryn touched on this already a bit, I think, but one is really establishing routines, right? So routines let your brain and your body know what to expect. So if you set the time that you're going to wake up, if you set the time that you're going to go to bed, if you set a time when you're going to move your body, or when you're going to work and when you're going versus when you're going to help your kids with school, right? Routines make it easier for your body to know what's coming next, so that it's like your body and your brain don't have to worry about it, so they can focus on other things, right? It doesn't become stressful. The second thing is to take breaks, take frequent breaks. When you're on a lot of video meetings in a row, it can be hard to get up from your desk throughout the day, right? But those breaks are actually really important. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I've definitely noticed that when I'm in the office, I'm kind of constantly getting up and going to another meeting or going to talk to someone about something. So I'm taking like these little breaks where I'm moving and I'm getting up from my desk all day. But now we're sitting down a lot and we're on video calls a lot, which means that we can't really get up and move. But remember that your brain can really only focus intently for about 90 minutes at a time, and then it needs a break. So taking even 5 or 10 minutes in between meetings to just get up, go get a glass of water, get up, walk outside for a second, get up, look out the window, do something that is not work. But because we're not in an office setting, we have to plan those breaks. So plan them into your day. Maybe create a reminder for yourself, like a rubber band or something around your wrist that reminds you to take a break, or set a little reminder on your phone to do it. That can be helpful too. And the last thing that I'd say is just to remember that when you're working remotely and teaching your kids and worried about your friends and family, it's okay to not be productive sometimes, right? Our brains are just getting used to the fact that we're in this new reality, and there's a lot of pressure out there to be productive. There's a lot of pressure that I've seen out there, for example, to like learn how to make sourdough or to, learn some new skill. Don't buy into that. If you want to learn how to make sourdough, have at it, go do it. But if really what you want to do is just go and lie down on the couch at the end of the day and take a nap, do that, right? Your brain's working hard enough already, learning this new reality. And that's plenty to do. So listen to what your body needs and do what your body needs. And it's okay if that's not something that is super productive.
Yeah, thank you for that. I especially like the, it's okay to take breaks. This is not a normal reality, and we shouldn't be treating it as such. So I appreciate that. Okay, so, thank you both so much. We're now going to take a couple of questions from the audience. And so I believe we have our first one coming in. Okay, so Kerryn, this one's for you. Kerryn, can you talk about specific bite-sized tasks for staff to engage in DEIJ or advance organizational efforts during this pandemic?
Yes, I'm happy to. So one of the things that I've worked with a partner on recently was thinking about sort of these digital Heritage Month campaigns, right? So we're just coming off of the heels of Women's History Month. And I mentioned before that we're moving into Earth Day, for example, or Take Your Children to Work Day, which for those of us that have them can, at the end of April. I mean, it could be as simple as using your company intranet or sending out one of your newsletters to ask employees to send in a picture with a phrase that they'd like to finish. My kid learned about my work today by, and it's a picture of the kid with the sign, right? It takes literally 5 seconds or maybe even 5 minutes to get your kid to cooperate, to write the sign, hold up the sign, take the picture, and then share it, right? And what you've done is basically made, staff smile, both seeing themselves and their coworkers with their little mini me's for just a momentary interruption in the day. That's one example.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And the next question by Jasmine, how important is transparency from leadership to staff during this time?
I can start that, and Kerryn, if you want to jump in. I think it's incredibly important to be transparent during this time. Recognize that your staff are scared, right? They're scared about what's happening. They may be afraid for their jobs. They may be afraid of what's happening to your organization. So I think that erring on the side of transparency is a good idea. I would temper it a little bit with recognizing that people are stressed and anxious. And so, again, what I said before about not being mindful about transmitting your own stress or about catastrophizing. I think we all tend to jump to worst case scenario right now. And it's really important to recognize when you're doing that because that's not helpful for your staff. Like, your staff want to be motivated. They want to know that you're leading. They want you to be transparent. But they also want you to lead them. So Kerryn, you might have more to add there.
Yeah, that's right. So kind of wearing my corporate communications hat for a minute, echo everything that Patty said, and I'd add to it, and it's okay to communicate when you're not sure right now. I think it's okay to say, you know what, we are not sure about what tomorrow or next week or next month or next quarter holds, but here's what we do know. And to Patty's point, being very prescriptive about how you deliver that message, the words that you use, the frequency and platforms that you use to deliver it. And I think it's the tone and tenor of, you know what, but we're all in this together, and we will focus on what we need to do to make sure that staff, stakeholders, communities alike feel taken care of in this moment. And I would add to that, it's then actually walking that talk, right? So if you say you're focused on taking care of staff, take care of staff.
Great, thank you. And I believe we have one more question from Ashley. Could you also speak to what equity looks like with respect to salary reductions, furloughs, and layoffs across all levels of the organization? So Kerryn, would you like to start us off?
I can start. So I have always led from the place of data in any of the work that I have, any of the organizations that I've worked with in doing this work. And so really ensuring that you have a pretty accurate picture of where staff sits in the organization, what at what level they're performing, really making sure that, and then overlaying into that representation, right? Because what you don't want, and which is what we're talking about, is that there be any adverse impact, right, to any particular marginalized population. So I think when you're thinking about salary reductions, furloughs, and layoffs, it's really making sure that you are looking through the lens of, again, where people are sitting in the organization, what the demographics within that particular area of your organization, like what does representation look like, and then really understanding how you have to make those decisions based on needs for the organization juxtaposed against performance, right? So it's a real opportunity for you to lean very heavily into your workforce reports and metrics, including making sure that you have documentation around job descriptions and functions, what people are doing in the organization, and quite frankly, how well they're doing them.
Great. And I believe we have one more question. Can you talk on best practices a workplace can take when virtually entering an employee's personal space, particularly how to respect others' contact preferences and privacy?
Patty, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start on that. One thing is to really pay attention to one of the things that I know I do and Kerryn does as well is when we have to help our kids with something, because we're both also now teachers. Also, all teachers should make at least $1 million a year each.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we do is we try to be really clear with our teams on, here are the times when we're going to be helping our kids with something. Here are the times when I am not available because of X, Y, or Z. And here are the times when I am available for you. And here are the times when I'm actually going to be like getting work done, right? So we try to be clear about that so that people have less, people know when we're kind of in our personal space and when we're in our workspace, because it can be so hard to keep those boundaries right now. So I would say that is one technique that we've used, and to just be really sensitive about it, and to say to someone, I don't know if you are in personal time right now, or if you're in work time, can you let me know? Or just, being very transparent and asking, is now a good time to talk, because they may have a crying baby or something, things happen. So those are some things that I'd say about it. But Kerryn, I think you probably have more to say as well.
Yeah, I think everything that you mentioned is spot on. I mean, talk about sort of there being no room to cover. My calendar is open. So it's, my colleagues get a little laugh when they see, oh, okay, Kerryn's helping Aubrey with her worksheets right now. Like, she kind of can't talk to us, or she's gonna, have a little 5-year-old head bobbing next to her. And I think, again, like you said, Patty, just being sort of very open and transparent about what your schedule is, and when you can be present, or if you will be, but you'll be slightly distracted, and being very clear about when you'll have to sign off or take a step back, I think is right. And, one of the things I've appreciated so much about my coworkers was really even just that they're asking, right? They'll take a look at my calendar, see it's there. And it's this lovely give and take of, yeah, I do have this going on, but you know what? I can move this up and pop this down, and I'm free, right? So it goes back to sort of that grace and that flexibility that I think we all talked about during this time.
Although we do love to see Aubrey's cute face.
Oh, thank you. And she loves to be seen.
I will say just quickly, and I know we're going to close. I know one person had a question about whether or not we're going to share the slides, and I'm sure we can do that. That's
definitely. Yeah. Yes, and I believe we'll also have today's webinar available as well afterwards. I just want to thank you both, Kerryn and Patty, for your thoughtful insight, for all these nice gold nuggets that you provided us with today. I really want to thank you for your conversation and for taking the time. And also, I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate it. So thank you so much, and happy Monday. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to go to rabengroup.com. And thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And thanks,
everyone. Thank you so much.